Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. The way the Arch-Emperor smiled made him seem very different from before. His left eye had been dug out, seemingly by himself. Normally speaking, he shouldn't have aged so dramatically, but because of his years of imprisonment and the brutal ways the vile prince had used him for research purposes, he was the magnificent reigning Arch-Emperor. Back in the Wildlands, the Grand Heaven Master had turned him into a puppet ruler, but formally, he was still the most respected ruler in the world, a person toward whom innumerable citizens offered worship. But now, his bleak and battered state caused Bai Xiaochun to tremble. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but his words stuck in his throat as he thought back to what the Arch-Emperor had been like back in the Wildlands. Right now, he looked like a completely different person. Never could Bai Xiaochun have guessed that he might see the Arch-Emperor right here and now. When the vile prince sensed the fluctuations of Bai Xiaochun's divine sense, his eyes glittered, and a feeling of immense pride rose up in his heart. He had racked his brains to come up with ideas to deal with Bai Xiaochun, to force him to commit some mistake or crime. After all, he was an ambassador, in a sensitive position. But if the vile prince could get him to do something bad enough, then it would make things much easier. The truth was that the vile prince truly did want to get his hands on Bai Xiaochun's physical body, and most specifically, all of his blood. He was confident that, with his blood, he could unlock the secrets of the Arch-Sovereign's bloodline, his goal being to learn about both spirit enhancement and hereditary cultivation techniques. By now, it was no secret in the eternal immortal domains that Bai Xiaochun had cultivated the undying live forever technique. And his heaven-defying powers of regeneration had left many opponents shaken. The vile prince had already acquired the necessary manuals describing the technique. However, he was unable to cultivate them. Only people with the blood of the Heavenspan realm could do so. That was the most fundamental requirement for the technique. And thus, the vile prince passionately wanted to take Bai Xiaochun's body. Now that he had finally found a way to get under Bai Xiaochun's skin, he began to chuckle loudly. Ambassador Bai, I'm very interested in spirit enhancement. And as you know, I pursue perfection in all things. Part by part, I've even replaced my own body inside and out. Listen, I won't lie to you. I already have a bit of Heavenspan realm blood in me, and have begun to acquire a basic understanding of spirit enhancement. But the blood I have just isn't enough. My father the Emperor has already approved my request to refine the Arch-Emperor, and use his flesh and blood to create a new arm for myself. It will be an arm completely imbued with the blood of the Heavenspan realm. With that, I am confident that I'll unlock the secrets of the Arch-Sovereign's bloodline. As of this point, the vile prince seemed completely crazed, as if he were truly insane. And yet, most of the people bearing witness to what was playing out, even the demigods, seemed envious of him. At this point, the vile prince lifted his left hand and then slashed it down, instantly chopping off his right arm. Even as blood sprayed out everywhere, he reached out, grabbed the Arch-Emperor, and began to drag him toward the open wound. Tendrils of muscle and flesh then snaked out in bizarre and sinister fashion, boring into the Arch-Emperor's body. Although he trembled and spasmed, he continued to smile as he looked at Bai Xiaochun. And then, he managed to speak. My left eye contained all of the secrets of the Arch-Sovereign's bloodline. No one will ever get them. From the first day I began to suffer this humiliation, and came to learn of their thirst for such secrets, I dug that eye out and destroyed it. The secrets of the Arch-Sovereign's bloodline are the foundation of the Heavenspan realm. They are everything, and no one will ever take them away. It took the last scraps of energy the Arch-Emperor had to be able to speak such words in front of all the officials of the vile Emperor dynasty, and even the vile Emperor himself. Furthermore, it was clear that his words were directed toward one person, Bai Xiaochun. He knew that although Bai Xiaochun's blood was not the most true and orthodox, in some ways, it surpassed his own. He also knew that he was the emperor of the Heavenspan realm. Perhaps he was the last emperor, but that was his fault, and he had to bear the responsibility. Even if he couldn't be the emperor anymore, he still could not let the secrets of his bloodline fall into the hands of an enemy. Instead, he would trust Bai Xiaochun. From the moment I dug out my left eye, I ceased to be the Arch-Emperor. Today I die, but not as an emperor. I am only an ordinary demigod from the Heavenspan realm. He threw his head back and laughed uproariously, at the same time trembling as the tendrils of flesh and muscle from the vile prince dug into him. He was already withering up physically, almost like melting wax. And yet, his voice thrummed with excitement, and despite his weakened state, echoed out in all directions. I am no longer the Arch-Emperor. The true Arch-Emperor. appeared in the moment that the heavenspan realm was destroyed. Even as his laughter began to fade, his left eye socket began to glow with bright light. And that light shone on one person. Bai Xiaochun. He hadn't yet finished speaking, and yet everyone in the imperial palace knew exactly what he meant when he said that a new arch-emperor had appeared. That person was obviously Bai Xiaochun. The vile prince was not absorbing the arch-emperor. Instead, he was giving the old arch-emperor a chance to formally choose his successor, with the officials of the vile emperor dynasty present to bear witness. The successor of the arch-emperor. Even as his words continued to echo within the imperial palace, the old arch-emperor withered away, becoming increasingly unrecognizable. Slowly but surely, his left eye went dark. However, despite his bitter state, his smile remained. He had finally discharged all of his responsibilities. Bai Xiaochun trembled, his eyes welling up with tears as he clasped hands and bowed deeply. It was a show of respect to the previous arch-emperor, a display of respect to a great hero. In the past, he might not have been a hero, but now he was. Even though it happened in the last moment, that did not change its significance. Not even the vile prince could ever have guessed that something like this would happen. Immediately, he felt overwhelmed with humiliation. Howling, he took the lump of flesh and blood that was the old arch-emperor and sent wriggling tendrils of flesh and blood all over him until he became an arm. Then the arm was pulled back toward the wound on his shoulder, and was stitched to it. The power of the blood of the heavenspan realm immediately began to emanate from the arm, and when the vile prince detected that, he clenched his hand into a fist and started laughing. "What do you think of my new arm, Ambassador Bai?" he said, looking over at Bai Xiaochun with narrowed eyes. "Do you sense that aura of spirit enhancement?" Bai Xiaochun was still lowered in a bow. However, his eyes were so bloodshot they seemed like they might start bleeding, and the impulse to take action began to rise up in his heart. There was no way he could respond to the vile prince in this moment. The killing intent in his heart was so strong that it towered to the heavens, and if he unleashed it, it would lead to destruction of a cataclysmic nature. He stared with burning eyes at the vile prince, then turned his gaze to the vile emperor. "Your Majesty, the vile emperor. I might be from the heavenspan realm, but I'm also the ambassador of the Saint Emperor dynasty. Furthermore, I'm one of only 12 celestials in the entire eternal immortal domains. In this so-called banquet of yours, a demigod prince of your dynasty has heaped utter humiliation onto me, which was completely uncalled for. If this happens again, then I don't think you can blame me for killing someone." With that, he turned and left. The vile prince felt like he was going crazy. The look in Bai Xiaochun's eyes moments ago had been far more intense than earlier, and had burned into the prince's heart like a red-hot branding iron. Before he could say anything further, Bai Xiaochun was gone. At that point, the vile prince began to grow somewhat calm, although fury still burned inside of him. As he tried to decide what to do next, the vile emperor looked at him, a trace of ridicule in his eyes that no one else could detect. Some of that ridicule was for Bai Xiaochun, but most of it was for the vile prince. Without saying another word, he rose to his feet and left, followed by Virapaksa and the others. All of them knew that, on this occasion, Bai Xiaochun had somehow managed to avert a major catastrophe. Eventually, the vile prince was left alone, his face distorted with rage, and his eyes flickering with insanity. "You're mine, Bai Xiaochun. I will have your body." Flicking his sleeve angrily, he turned and stalked off. Bai Xiaochun didn't even remember returning to the embassy. He was virtually soulless, almost like the Walking Dead. All he could think about was how much he hated being weak, and how much he detested being so useless. He felt like his heart had been ripped in two. One part was saying that he couldn't have done anything to change the situation. But the other part was screaming in rage, telling him that he should have done something to rescue the arch-emperor from his pain and misery. The mental anguish and torment caused tears to well up in Bai Xiaochun's eyes, until he felt like he might collapse at any moment. He didn't feel capable of handling the responsibility that had been thrust upon his shoulders. After all, he usually lived by the seat of his pants, pragmatically handling situations as they arose. But somehow, he had become the hope of everyone from the heavenspan realm. He didn't dare to think about what would have happened if, instead of the arch-emperor, it had been Li Qinghao, Song Junwan, Mistress Red Dust or Big Fatty Zhang. Then what would have happened? My cultivation base. It's all about my cultivation base. If only I were an Archean. Eyes bloodshot, he clenched his hands into fists, his determination to become stronger rapidly turning into full-on madness. He took out the great sword of the north and studied it, thinking back to what the northern Heavenspan River region had been like. After a moment, he pulled out his turtle walk, and using his new stockpile of multicolored flame, began to enhance it. As more and more spirit designs appeared, the aura of the sword began to change. Eventually, it emanated an air of sharpness and strength that was profoundly shocking. This sword is not enough to fight an Archean. He put away the great sword of the north and then vanished from his private chamber. When he reappeared, he was back on the damaged fan. As of this moment, his killing intent and madness had reached the point that he needed to vent, lest he collapse mentally. And the best way to vent would be to challenge the levels of the fan. He didn't even bother to calculate whether or not the spirit automaton was asleep. Without any hesitation, he flew directly into the next level. Rumbling sounds echoed out within the world around him as he summoned the great sword of the north and unleashed it in a powerful attack. Backed by the power of his fleshly body as well as his cultivation base, he used it to vent his madness and anger by destroying the entire level. 85th level, 86th, 87th, the levels got harder and harder, but he was in a state of complete madness. It didn't matter what appeared within the levels, he saw nothing but the color of blood as he unleashed shocking slaughter. Kill, kill, kill. His killing intent seemed to sink into the depths of his cultivation base, merging with it, pushing him to a higher level than he could have imagined. In the past, it couldn't have happened. But because of the slaughter he was unleashing, he was being tempered, pushing his battle prowess to an even higher level. 88th level, 89th level. By the time he reached the 90th level, his wounds were far worse than they had been at any time in the past when challenging the damaged fan. His undying codex was operating in shocking fashion, and his attacks were the type that had only been seen previously in the Heavenspan realm, the type in which he sustained damage to inflict fatal blows. It was a unique fighting style that Bai Xiaochun had begun to develop starting in the Luokan Mountains. By now, although it couldn't be said to have reached a state of perfection, it was certainly getting close to that point. His blood boiled as he vented, and the madness in his eyes raged. And it all reached a head in the 90th level. The 90th level was a world of heat and fire, its sky filled with leaden clouds and the glow of fire. The entire world rumbled as lava and flames spewed from the tops of seemingly endless volcanoes that stretched out in all directions. Within that violent world roamed 3 enormous stone beetles, each one fully 30,000 meters from end to end. As they moved about, they smashed into the occasional volcano, sending lava and fire roiling out in all directions. Worst of all was that, although the lava and fire didn't hurt the stone beetles, it would melt any rock it touched. In the end, the world was like a sea of molten fire, across which rolled waves of a terrifying nature. One of the stone beetles noticed Bai Xiaochun as soon as he appeared within the world. Roaring, it turned into a blur of afterimages as it shot toward him ravenously. On any other occasion, Bai Xiaochun would have dodged out of the way. But this time, he simply waved his hand and utilized the living mountain incantation. The air around him rippled and distorted as massive rocks and boulders flew toward him, rapidly transforming him into a stone golem. Instead of backing up to brace for impact, he lunged forward, the deafening roar that erupted from his mouth completely surpassing that of the stone beetle. Then, the entire world shook and trembled as the other 2 stone beetles began to charge toward Bai Xiaochun as well. A few days later, he emerged from the 90th level, soaked in blood, his right arm missing, and his skull visible on the left side of his face. However, instead of the lunacy that had burned in his eyes before, they were now calm, although within the depths of that calm simmered violence and rage. After passing the 90th level, he returned to the main square of the fan. At that point, he coughed up a massive mouthful of blood, and then toppled forward onto his face. A long moment passed, and then he struggled up into a cross-legged position to do breathing exercises. As his cultivation base rotated, and the regenerative powers of his fleshly body worked away, 3 days passed. Eventually, his arm grew back, and his face healed. At that point, he opened his eyes. However, his session of cultivation was not yet over. The blood of the stone beetles he had fought was shockingly corrosive. As such, it was taking much longer for his powers of regeneration to get him completely back to normal. At around that time, a massive tremor suddenly shook the entire damaged fan. At the same time, an aura which shocked Bai Xiaochun to the core swept into the damaged fan from the void beyond. Shocked, he rose to his feet and walked over to the edge of the fan, where he peered out into the darkness. Eventually, his eyes went wide, and his heart trembled with shock. "Is that?" he gasped as he saw, far out in the darkness of the void, a soft glow of light. As it neared, he could see that it was huge, fully 30,000 meters from one end to the other. There, floating through the void, glowing with light, was a huge arm. It did not look like the arm of a cultivator, but rather, wolf-like, complete with claws. As the arm neared, the entire damaged fan trembled. At the same time, Bai Xiaochun realized that he recognized the aura of the arm. Heavens! That's a sovereign aura. Even as he realized this, a shriek could be heard from behind him, its source being none other than the spirit automaton. Which sovereign? Let me look more closely. I see. That arm likely belonged to Gao Tianxian from the Wolf Devil realm. Yeah, it must be him. He was one of the weakest sovereigns back in the day, and there's no way I would mistake his aura for someone else's. Gao Tianxian's left arm. Bai Xiaochun, lend me your control over the fan. With the power from that arm, I can increase the speed of the fan, and reunite it with its other half even sooner. And I promise to only interfere with one of the remaining levels. The spirit automaton was so excited that he blurted out some bits of information that should have remained secret to Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun's eyes flickered, but he didn't say anything. Although this sovereign's arm was enticing, he didn't trust the spirit automaton at all. Even as the damaged fan sped toward the arm, it suddenly moved. Unexpectedly, numerous vengeful souls began to stream out from it and head toward the damaged fan, shrieking soundlessly, their eyes filled with greed and madness. Souls, Bai Xiaochun said, his eyes widening. This was not Bai Xiaochun's first time seeing vengeful souls out in the void. After all, he had already acquired an Archean soul from that enormous floating palace he had seen. But when he saw this host of vengeful souls streaming out from the sovereign's arm, he couldn't help but start getting excited. Ever since he had arrived in the eternal immortal domains, he had lacked vengeful souls. Only the trial level filled with souls that he had passed earlier had replenished his stocks to some degree, but even that hadn't been enough. Unfortunately, he couldn't get back into that level to get more souls, and even if he did, there were only so many inside. Even if he got all of them, he would still come up short. So, there really are vengeful souls out here in the void. Staring intently at them, he unhesitatingly declared, "All right, little automaton, I'll trust you just this once." He released his hold of authority over the fan, the only reason being that he knew that even if the spirit automaton got greedy, he could take it back if necessary. After all, his level of authority over the fan now surpassed the spirit automaton's. Of course, because he hadn't yet passed the 100th level, he didn't have the ability to use the fan's divine abilities, or control it completely. The spirit automaton was thrilled to find that Bai Xiaochun was relinquishing his authority. Quickly unleashing his divine sense, he called upon the powers at his disposal to cause the fan to glow with dazzling light. At the same time, he pointed his finger out at the approaching souls. "Be subdued," he said, his voice resounding like heavenly thunder, and sending ripples out into the void. At the same time, the image on the face of the fan began to move as if it were alive. That image depicted a mountain, atop which was a tower, and beneath which was a river. On the river was a boat, within which could be seen two men playing Go. Also in the water of the river was a palace. As the image on the fan rippled, one of the men on the boat waved his right arm, which caused a huge gravitational force to appear out in the void. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the vengeful souls shrieked, transforming into streaks of light that shot into the image of the river on the fan. As for the severed arm, it shivered visibly. If the arm had been attached to the sovereign it had once belonged to, then the spirit automaton of the damaged fan would have been helpless to do anything about it. But now that it was no longer attached, matters were much simpler. Gradually, the arm slowed down, then touched the fan, whereupon it was also dragged into the picture. However, during the process, the fan trembled, as though some massive pressure had begun to weigh down on it. After all, that arm was not the flesh and blood of a sovereign clone, but rather, an actual limb from a real sovereign. The spirit automaton was weakening visibly, his eyes bloodshot as he went all out to make sure the process went smoothly. Bai Xiaochun stood off to the side, both surprised and nervous about what was happening. After all, back when he had acquired the Archean soul, the fan had not been under the control of the spirit automaton, and yet had still put on a very impressive display. But now, with the spirit automaton controlling the fan, the image on its face emitted a shocking aura. That was especially true of the man on the boat. After all, he was pulling in the sovereign's arm in completely astonishing fashion. This magical item is totally incredible. After the arm was pulled into the fan, Bai Xiaochun looked on in excitement as the picture on the face of the fan gained a new element, an enormous arm. If I can actually control this fan one day, then who cares if I have to face the vile emperor? I could crush him with the wave of a finger. Heart-pounding, he imagined what it would be like to rout an Archean in that fashion. After the sovereign's arm was fully absorbed, the damaged fan began to emit even more radiant light than before. And then, just as the spirit automaton had said, the fan used the influx of power to begin to move even faster. The spirit automaton seemed to be severely drained. Gasping for breath, he turned into a beam of light that shot back toward the fan to go back to sleep. At the same time, the authority he had borrowed from Bai Xiaochun was relinquished. However, Bai Xiaochun wasn't willing to let him go so quickly. Before he could vanish, he shouted, "Hey, I didn't give you my authority just to be nice. I don't want the arm, but give me the souls." The spirit automaton sighed and muttered inaudibly to himself for a moment. Then, for some unknown reason, it actually complied with Bai Xiaochun's request. Sending some divine sense into the fan, it caused a vast quantity of vengeful souls to fly out from the arm toward Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun excitedly collected the souls, the weakest of which was at the nascent soul level. Many of them were diva souls, and there were even a good number of demigod souls. Most shockingly, there were 3 Archean souls. Bai Xiaochun nearly began to dance with joy. As he put all the souls away, the spirit automaton entered the fan and went to sleep. At the same time, Bai Xiaochun sat down cross-legged, and waited until he was sure the spirit automaton was fully asleep. Then, as the damaged fan continued to sail along through the void, he began to conjure flame. With this most recent influx of souls, he could now conjure beyond the level of 15 colors without worrying about wasting too much. "I'm going to conjure 22-colored flame," he said, his eyes bloodshot. He had dreamed of this moment back in the Heavenspan realm, but had never been able to succeed. Then, after arriving in the eternal immortal domains, he had felt confident but had lacked ingredients. Throwing his arms wide, he summoned a vast collection of souls, and began to conjure. Meanwhile, back in the eternal immortal domains, near Vile Emperor City, was the coalition of cultivators who Big Fatty Zhang had secretly been helping. Among them were Li Qinghao and Patriarch Spirit Stream. Furthermore, in recent days, there were 2 new additions. The first was Song Junwan, and the other was Mistress Red Dust. They had come after hearing that Bai Xiaochun had been made the ambassador in Vile Emperor City, and neither wanted their children to be born without the father at least being there to see them. Song Junwan had been protected by Bruiser this entire time, whereas Mistress Red Dust didn't need any help at all. Both of them had visibly protruding bellies. When Li Qinghao, Patriarch Spirit Stream, and the others saw that, their eyes went wide. Song Junwan took the stairs in stride. As for Mistress Red Dust, she simply blurted out the name of her child's father, causing many jaws to drop. Then, a murderous look appeared in Song Junwan's eyes. Snorting coldly, she announced the name of her own child's father. At that point, Patriarch Spirit Stream cleared his throat and hurried away. As for Li Qinghao, he smiled wryly, and then did his best to console the one and pacify the other. Eventually, he got them calmed down. At that point, he returned to his residence and angrily grumbled to himself, "I can't believe the little brat knocked up 2 at the same time." Of course, despite his seeming front of anger, he couldn't cover the happy smile that spread out across his face. Perhaps it was because of the happy reunions which had just taken place, but back on the damaged fan, Bai Xiaochun suddenly looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his expression exhausted, and yet clearly filled with excitement. It worked. He threw his head back and laughed uproariously, extending his hand, causing the unprecedentedly bright light of a 22-colored flame to illuminate the entire fan. Because of it, the damaged fan became a burning torch in the darkness of the endless void. Although the sight of the 22-colored flame was very exciting to Bai Xiaochun, it also caused his mood to sink as he thought back to the last time he had seen such a flame, back in the Heavenspan realm, when Bai Hao saved his life. By igniting himself, he had created a flame that surpassed the very limits of the world around him. Although Bai Xiaochun knew that he was innately skilled when it came to flame conjuring, he didn't come close to his own apprentice. Without Bai Hao, Bai Xiaochun may have been able to reach his current level on his own, but it would have taken much longer, and come at a far greater cost. Because of Bai Hao's genius, Bai Xiaochun's advancement in the art of flame conjuring had been incredibly smooth. Furthermore, Bai Hao's skill had been the key to snatching Bai Xiaochun out of the jaws of death. When it came to his apprentice, Bai Xiaochun felt much guilt, as well as profound pain. Whenever he thought of him, he couldn't help but think back to everything that had occurred in the wildlands, and how they had relied on each other to survive. "Howard," he murmured in a voice that only he could hear, "it won't be long now. Master is definitely going to resurrect you by means of the flame." He looked down at the mark on the back of his hand, and after a long moment passed, left the damaged fan, completely wrapped up in his memories. He was not the carefree and happy-go-lucky Bai Xiaochun that he had been in the past. He carried great weight on his shoulders now. And then there were the events that had played out in the imperial palace. The vile prince had viciously humiliated the people of the Heavenspan realm, and the Arch-Emperor himself, right in front of Bai Xiaochun. And Bai Xiaochun could not feign indifference to the Arch-Emperor's defeated and yet victorious gaze as he named him successor. Strength and cultivation base. After returning to his private chamber in the embassy in Vile Emperor City, he immediately sat down cross-legged, arranged his spoils from this trip to the fan, and began to work on his cultivation. Although the spirit automaton had claimed that he would only interfere in one of the following levels, Bai Xiaochun didn't completely trust him. Besides, even without interference, the levels would only continue to get more difficult. He was already at the 90th, which meant that he only had 10 more to go before achieving true success. Failure was not an option. The only thing he could do now was take the rewards he had earned at the ends of the levels, the various medicinal pills and other items, and use them to advance his cultivation base. That was the only way he could win in the end. If he succeeded, the ultimate reward would be stupendous beyond imagination. And that became a great motivating factor. Half a month passed, which he spent entirely focused on his cultivation. Thanks to the rewards he had earned from the damaged fan, his cultivation base continued to advance, pushing him ever closer to the peak of the mid-celestial realm. Eventually, 2 people arrived at the embassy, both women. One of them was tall, slender, and particularly beautiful, with a celestial cultivation base. Bai Xiaochun almost immediately detected her presence. Gongsun Wanner? Bai Xiaochun opened his eyes and sent some divine sense out to check out the situation. Immediately, he caught sight of a young woman standing next to Gongsun Wanner, and a tremor passed through him. Xiaomei, he blurted. Vanishing, he reappeared right in front of Gongsun Wanner and Hu Xiaomei, whose cultivation base was now in the Diva realm. Hu Xiaomei had long since been an apprentice of Gongsun Wanner, and had been in seclusion ever since Bai Xiaochun had arrived in the eternal immortal domains. They hadn't seen each other for many years, and Hu Xiaomei looked somewhat different. Perhaps it was because of the technique she cultivated, but she was now even more eye-catching than before. There was also a frigid aura to her that resembled Gongsun Wanner's. Despite that, as soon as she laid eyes on Bai Xiaochun, her eyes lit up with a smile of excitement and happiness. There was a warmth in her gaze that had always been there, and it was now even more intense than it had been back in the Heavenspan realm. When that warmth combined with the frigid coldness she had now, it made her even more bewitchingly attractive than ever. Big Bro Xiaochun. Her eyes seemed red as if with tears as she looked at him. He was very different to her from before, older and more mature. Although other people might not be able to tell, to her, he looked like another person altogether than the Bai Xiaochun she remembered from the ovens back in the Spirit Stream sect. She knew the reason for all of it. Her master had explained everything after she came out of seclusion. It had been difficult for Hu Xiaomei to accept, although she seemed strong on the outside, she was actually very sensitive. But in the end, she had no choice. Upon hearing that Bai Xiaochun was in Vile Emperor City, her heart began to pound with strange emotions. And before she could even ask it, Gongsun Wanner brought her here. Once she saw him in front of her, the rest of the world disappeared, and time slowed down. As she stepped forward and slowly wrapped her arms around him, he looked down and embraced her. They said nothing. It was as if, during all the years that they had been apart, they had simply been waiting to reunite, and hold each other in their arms. Mixed emotions flickered in Gongsun Wanner's eyes as she looked on. Then she backed up to give them a slight bit of privacy. Bai Xiaochun noticed that, and his eyes flickered to meet hers. They shone with gratitude, thankfulness for how she had taken care of Hu Xiaomei, and appreciation for bringing her here now. The truth was that Gongsun Wanner had feared Bai Xiaochun might do something drastic after the events in the Imperial Palace. Therefore, she had brought Hu Xiaomei here in the hopes of bringing him a bit of consolation. Bai Xiaochun knew that Hu Xiaomei would be much safer with Gongsun Wanner than she would with him. But for the moment, he lowered his head and began to whisper softly into her ear, telling her about everything that had happened since their separation. Soon, evening had fallen, and the time had come for Hu Xiaomei to leave with Gongsun Wanner. Looking into Hu Xiaomei's eyes, Bai Xiaochun quietly said, "Wait for me, Xiaomei. I'll take you away with me soon, very soon." Hu Xiaomei was not the ditzy girl she had been in the past. Whether it was her personal experiences on Heavenspan Island, or the things that Gongsun Wanner had told her later, she was very well aware that Bai Xiaochun couldn't afford to have people near him who could be used against him, or who might hold him back. Although she didn't want to leave him, she knew she had to. Tears welling up in her eyes, she kissed him on the lips, then turned to leave. As she departed, Bai Xiaochun savored the warmth of her lips, and her lingering fragrance. Moments passed, and his eyes began to shine with determination, strength, and cultivation base. After returning to his private chamber, he vanished and reappeared on the damaged fan, where he began to challenge the levels again. They were all very difficult, to the point where he failed numerous times before passing them. There was no need for the spirit automaton to interfere. Furthermore, he had interfered too many times in the past, and currently was not even close to matching up to Bai Xiaochun in terms of authority. The automaton had said he would only interfere once, and the truth was that, because of his waning authority, he truly could not do so more than once in the last 10 levels. Days slipped by. Bai Xiaochun was completely absorbed in challenging the levels. Whenever he was forced to rest for a bit, he would take advantage of the time to research 23-colored flame. In this manner, half a year passed. During that time, the Vile Prince kept a very low profile and didn't cause problems for Bai Xiaochun. Because of the incident in the Imperial Palace, most of the other Celestials were warier of Bai Xiaochun than ever, and resolved never to offend him if at all possible. After all, the Vile Prince had already openly shown his hostility. Therefore, all they needed to do was wait and watch the sparks fly whenever their inevitable showdown occurred. Most relevant in the entire situation was that the Vile Emperor had apparently reached a critical moment in cultivating a certain Taoist magic, and had gone into protracted secluded meditation. There was something different about this session of seclusion. The Vile Emperor had left orders explicitly stating that unless a matter that pertained to the possible fall of the entire Vile Emperor dynasty occurred, he was not to be disturbed. And thus, Vile Emperor City quieted down. However, to those who were in the know, it seemed like the quiet that came before a storm of monumental proportions. As time passed, Bai Xiaochun slowly slipped into a state of complete frenzy. It was as if the only thing that existed in his life was his desire to pass the levels in the damaged fan, and to conjure a 23-colored flame. He rarely went back to Vile Emperor City. Because of how focused he was on cultivation, and the rewards he got at the ends of the levels, his cultivation base advanced in shocking fashion. In terms of the levels, his progress was not rapid. But considering how hard he was working, and his powers of regeneration, he eventually reached the 96th, 97th, and 98th levels. A few days after that, he finally passed the 98th level and reached the 99th level. The spirit automaton never showed his face. However, the more progress Bai Xiaochun made, the more on guard he was. He knew that the automaton would most likely make his move in one of the final 2 levels. Bai Xiaochun's guess was that it would come in the 100th level. However, as it turned out, it was when he reached the 99th level that the spirit automaton woke up for the first time after drawing upon the powers of the damaged fan to acquire that sovereign's arm. The 99th level, he blurted as soon as he opened his eyes. The truth was that he had left a marker behind in the 99th level that would awaken him if Bai Xiaochun reached it. Under normal circumstances, he would have just rested until he was fully recovered from the extremely draining ordeal. However, he hated Bai Xiaochun so much that he had arranged for a way to be woken up if necessary. Alright, Bai Xiaochun, Lord Automaton is going to make one last-ditch effort to stop you. If you succeed, then I guess I'll have to resign myself to the fate the heavens have decreed. The spirit automaton took a deep, shaky breath. He was not confident at all in this, his final attempt to interfere. On too many occasions in the past when he had been completely certain he would come out on top, Bai Xiaochun had gone on to show him what was meant by the unexpected, shamelessness, and cheating. By this point, the spirit automaton had actually begun to believe that everything had been fated. Sighing, he vanished from his current position to reappear within the 99th level. Some time earlier, the 99th level was different from any of the other levels. It consisted of a huge palace hovering in the air, of epic proportions. The main hall of the palace was almost half as large as the entire Saint Emperor dynasty. And at the end of the hall was a gigantic statue. It depicted a middle-aged man in a Taoist robe, looking off into the distance. The aura of the statue vastly surpassed that of the Archean realm, and seemed to coexist with the void itself. Bai Xiaochun gasped slightly at the sight of it. He felt shaken, with great pressure weighing down on him that caused him to struggle to breathe. Even his cultivation base felt a bit unstable. There was an alcove in the statue's forehead within which rested a throne. A cultivator could be seen sitting on the throne, although at this distance, it was difficult to make out his features even with divine sense, which was limited within the level. No matter how hard Bai Xiaochun strained with his divine sense or physical eyes, he couldn't make out any details, although he was fairly certain that the person on the throne was a sovereign. Most likely, it was the very person who had created the damaged fan to begin with, the same sovereign who reached enlightenment regarding the Tao essence of life and death. It seemed likely that only such a person would be able to occupy a throne like that, which looked out over all of the palace around it. Even as Bai Xiaochun strained to make out the details of the impressive figure in the forehead of that statue, a cold voice echoed out into the courtyard of the palace within which he stood. You might as well stop looking. As the words echoed out, Bai Xiaochun suddenly spun in place to find a middle-aged man standing roughly 300 meters behind him. He wore simple, homespun clothing and appeared ordinary in nature. However, he seemed at one with the world, and although he had his hands clasped behind his back, he looked like a black hole that could absorb any and all auras that existed around him. That is the statue of the exalted sovereign, the man continued, and in its forehead is a projection of the sovereign himself. He's looking at you. You are the first person to reach this level in all the years since it was created. Perhaps you do not have the blood of the immortal world in you, but since you were born in the eternal world, then you qualify to acquire the legacy. But in order to do so, you have to pass the final 2 levels. I am no powerful expert, only an Archean. And I'm only here in clone form, not in person, which means that this is my final resting place. Any challenger who can survive one of my fist strikes without dying, can pass this level. The man didn't bother to ask whether Bai Xiaochun agreed or not. He stepped forward, clenched his hand into a fist, and struck out at Bai Xiaochun, who was still about 300 meters away. In response, the entire 99th level filled with pressure that vastly surpassed that of a celestial. It was an Archean aura, with fluctuations that could destroy any form of life, that could rip apart the air, that could crush anything. And it was heading directly toward Bai Xiaochun. Archean, he blurted. Never could he have imagined that the requirement for this level would be to sustain a direct blow from an Archean and survive. There was no time for thought or planning. The pressure from this man filled Bai Xiaochun with a sensation of such crisis that he was instantly scared out of his mind. The power of his fleshly body flared to life as he threw his hands out in front of him, throwing in all the cultivation base power he could manage to push his defenses as high as they could go. Rocks and boulders materialized around him as his living mountain incantation took form, transforming him into an enormous stone golem. Then he used the cloud lightning forefather transformation, causing intense rumbling sounds to fill the air. Unfortunately, that was all that he could do before the explosive fist strike was upon him. It was the type of blow that could destroy anything in its path as easily as a boulder crushing a drinking glass. When it was still 30 meters away from him, his body began to vibrate, and the living mountain incantation shattered, sending stone shrapnel flying in all directions. His cloud lightning forefather form was also incapable of withstanding the force, and shattered when the fist was still 24 meters away. During the process, blood began to ooze out of the corners of his mouth, and he once again threw his hands out, resorting to his live forever lamp. Innumerable live forever lamps appeared, and even Bai Xiaochun transformed into one. It was as if the entire world had become filled with live forever lamps. And yet, in comparison to the fist strike, all of that was like a mantis trying to stop a war chariot. The fist was only 15 meters away when the live forever lamps collapsed. Bai Xiaochun was already in bad shape. Blood sprayed out of his mouth as he fell back, summoning the great sword of the north and slashing it toward the fist. Rumbling sounds echoed out as the enormous sword, which to date had never yet been defeated, was shoved backward by the fist, sending a backlash directly into Bai Xiaochun. By now, the fist strike was only 3 meters away from him. A huge glob of blood sprayed out of his mouth, and he lost his grip on the great sword of the north. In the time it takes a spark to fly off of a piece of flint, a shocking moment of crisis had appeared. The great sword of the north was still spinning away from him as the fist strike slammed into him, a destructive vortex of shocking nature. In that final moment, a streak of black light shot out, which was none other than the turtle walk. A massive boom rang out, seemingly violent enough to destroy the entire world. At the same time, Bai Xiaochun felt indescribably destructive power hitting the walk. It was the type of power that could destroy all types of cultivation bases, and instantly pushed his powers of regeneration to the ultimate limit. Blood sprayed out of his mouth as he was sent tumbling off into the distance like a kite with its string cut. His 5 yin organs and 6 yang organs all vibrated on the point of exploding. Even with the protection provided by the turtle walk, most of the bones in his body shattered. Then, he slammed into the ground, his vision fading as though he were teetering right at the gates of hell. Without his spectacular powers of regeneration, he would have been killed in body and soul. And that had all come from only a single fist strike by this middle-aged man. After sustaining the blow, the turtle walk turned into a black streak of light that shot back into his body. Clearly, he would not be able to summon it again anytime soon. Gasping for breath, he struggled to his feet and looked over at the middle-aged man, who looked back at him as he slowly lowered his fist. Smiling in approval, the man said, "You pass the lev." However, in that very moment, his eyes went blank, causing Bai Xiaochun's heart to begin to pound with a sense of profound dread. The man then spoke again, his tone sharper than before. "Any challenger who can survive one of my fist strikes without dying, can pass this level." With that, he began to unleash another fist strike. "Spirit automaton, show your face immediately." Bai Xiaochun shouted bitterly, "You're dead." Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.